Hello everyone, I'm Claudia and this is my presentation on sex work. So here's my table of contents. This shows everything we will be discussing today. We'll begin with the definition of sex work. We'll move on to the different types of sex work. We'll also talk about who are the sex workers and their characteristics. We'll talk about the difference between sex work and sex trafficking, which is extremely important to understand. We'll then move on to a conversation about criminalization of sex work, benefits of decriminalization, and we'll end with our discussion questions. So what is sex work? The commonly accepted definition of sex work is the exchange of sexual services for money or goods, including housing, food, drugs, and other basic necessities. What are the different types of sex work? There is a formal and informal approach to sex work. Formal means a sex worker is working for a third party, like a pimp or brothel owner. For those of you who may not know, a brothel is a house where men go to find a girl for services. The informal approach is when a sex worker is self-employed and they manage themselves. On the screen here, you see a couple forms of sex work, like street work, brothel work, escorting, being an adult actor, webcamming, and lap dancing. These are just some of the types of sex work. There are still several more out there. All of these here are pretty self-explanatory. Escorting is the only thing that can have two meanings. Escorting can either mean paying someone to spend their time with you, for example, being a +1 at an event. In California, there's actually a law that says if any sexual requests are made during this escort work, both parties are subject to criminal prosecution. Escorting, on the other hand, can also mean setting up a time to meet with a sex worker. So who are the sex workers? Sex workers most often will be women, but they can also be men. Sex workers can be of any race. Sex workers can also be of any age. Age is important when considering cases of sex trafficking because in those situations, the sex worker is often a minor. Sex workers can work independently with others, like their friends, or for a third party. In this case, as previously mentioned, the third party would be a pimp or a brothel owner. Sex workers can also have regular or sporadic schedules. This means that sex work itself could be someone's full-time job while it's someone else's part-time job. Or it can be just a job that gets picked up in times of absolute need. Going off of this, I read an article on The Guardian called "Why Do Women Become Sex Workers and Why Do Men Go to Them?" by Susanna Breslin. I read this article trying to find more characteristics of sex workers. I ended up finding out that more often than not, women become sex workers because of the need for money. There was a story given about how a woman was addicted to drugs, and in order to provide for her addiction, she resorted to sex work. Another story talked about how, due to college debt and not being able to find a job right out of college, a woman resorted to becoming a sex worker because times are tough. So let's talk about the difference between sex work and sex trafficking. It's important to understand this slight difference because personally, when I first started researching, they seemed pretty similar. The distinction between the two is consent. With sex work, the person who is offering their services is doing so willingly in return for money or goods. Sex trafficking, on the other hand, is when a person who is offering their services is not doing this willingly. They have been forced into doing so by a third party, like the person who lured them into being trafficked. Oftentimes, the victims of sex trafficking are minors, and as important as sex trafficking is, human trafficking is an even greater problem that is often overshadowed by the discussion of sex trafficking. In cases of human trafficking, people often get sent into manufacturing or industrial sectors of work. So to begin our criminalization discussion, it is important to understand the approach to sex work. There is an abolition approach which aims to abolish sex work in society through criminal penalties on clients as well as several other aspects. These criminal penalties serve to prohibit certain behavior. Through reducing certain behavior, the demand for sex work is reduced and eventually ceases to exist. At least this is the case in a perfect world. The overall goal with abolition is to protect the sex workers from possible exploitation. Because of criminalization, there is also increased violence for sex workers. Sex workers fear the police and have to hide from the public eye. Hiding from the public to do their job places sex workers in dangerous situations where they can be harmed. Sex workers become scared to report anything a client has done to them for fear of getting punished. The lack of reporting will only encourage the client to continue to harm the worker. Sex workers are also the targets of police officers, which makes them even more scared to report. There have been multiple cases where officers have assaulted, extorted, trafficked, raped, and murdered sex workers, and I will discuss one of these cases in the next slide. Often, officers who sexually assault a sex worker get away with it. Also, because of criminalization, there is increased stigma, which makes sex workers appear as criminally deviant, which is not always the case. They are people trying to make a living. Due to criminalization, the public is likely not to believe this and consider that workers' social bonds are broken. Continuing, criminalization causes sex workers to have lack of access to social services that could benefit them or their families. For example, they are unable to exercise certain rights like demanding police protection or getting a professional license. They are also made ineligible for financial aid if they meet income requirements. Lack of access to employment opportunities is another side effect of criminalization. Sex workers, because of a criminal record with possible time spent incarcerated, are unable to find a stable job once they get out of their incarceration period. Many jobs prefer to hire applicants with no criminal record or no history of being a sex worker. So, as I previously mentioned, sex workers have been the targets of police officers. In August 2018, in Columbus, Ohio, there was a case involving an officer, Andrew Mitchell, and a sex worker, Donna Dalton. Mitchell was in an unmarked police car working on a prostitution sting. It is unclear what happened in the car. Some sources would say there was an altercation, while others would say Mitchell attempted to arrest Dalton without properly identifying himself. What we do know is that Mitchell was stabbed in the hand by Dalton, to which he responded by shooting 9 times and killing her. Friends of Dalton, some of them sex workers, agreed that knives were carried and used only at times of self-defense, meaning that Dalton, in this case, was defending themselves. Following this case, an investigation took place. We learned that Mitchell had previous complaints. There was even 2 separate incidents where he kidnapped a sex worker and claimed they were arrested, and in exchange for being released, Mitchell demanded sex. This shows how sex workers' rights are disregarded by officers. They do not care if they abuse their authority with these people. In a way, you can say they're dehumanized. So here's a video that will talk about criminalization of sex workers, as well as why decriminalization should take place.
Too many people are incarcerated, and too many resources are spent targeting victimless crimes. Tens of thousands of people are arrested annually in the United States for prostitution and related charges. The majority of those arrested are adults who engage in consensual, victimless activities. Where sex work is decriminalized, law enforcement is able to focus resources on human trafficking and other violent crimes. Those who are arrested and jailed for buying or selling sex face incarceration, fines, parole, and probation. They are likely to end up with permanent records that hinder future opportunities for employment, housing, and other necessities. Too often, police abuse their powers and exploit or rape sex workers. Sex workers engaging in prostitution who are harmed by police officers have nowhere to turn for help. Decriminalization would empower sex workers and substantially reduce violence and exploitation in the sex industry. Tough on crime policies lead to mass incarceration. Decades of these policies have overcrowded American prisons with nonviolent offenders. The devastating consequences of the war on drugs have prompted reform. It is time for laws criminalizing and marginalizing sex workers to see the same shift. The cost of arresting people for victimless crimes, along with the additional cost of imprisonment, prosecution, and probation after the arrest, places a significant burden on taxpayers. Yet criminalization neither ends nor reduces prostitution. It solely pushes sex work further into the black market, where workers are unprotected from exploitation and abuse. We know what prohibition does to markets. The prohibition of alcohol failed to reduce the demand and made alcohol more dangerous. The prohibition of drugs did the same. Laws have been adapted to address these realities, replacing criminalization with harm reduction policies. Criminalizing sex work only amplifies the harms associated with it. Police and prisons are ill-equipped to improve the lives of people who are arrested for trying to earn a living in prostitution. Combating violence and abuse in sex work should be prioritized over arresting consenting adults. Decriminalizing sex work is good criminal justice policy. Learn more at decriminalizesex.org.
Moving on, here are the benefits of decriminalization. If decriminalization were to take place, money and resources for police departments would be better allocated for violent crimes, which will in turn benefit the police and create for better policing. Since sex work is a victimless crime, there is no reason for it to be criminalized since both parties are consenting. If there was no consent on one side, or if there was a violent client, then it would make sense to involve the police. But more often than not, this is not the case. Reduced exploitation is also a benefit of decriminalization. Officers would no longer look at sex workers as vulnerable and deviant. Instead, officers would focus on protecting these workers because they have rights like every other occupation. Another benefit to decriminalization is improved working conditions. Like I was just saying, sex workers have rights and they could exercise those rights by being able to decline services to a client and not fear retaliation. They could also do their job in a more visible setting rather than having to put themselves in danger as they were doing before because they had to be hidden by the police in public eye. Increased public health and safety is also a great benefit of decriminalization. This way, sex workers could get regular testing for sexually transmitted diseases, which promotes safety. In other countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Mongolia, and Vietnam, they employ mandates like the condom use program. This requires that a condom be used in paid sex transactions, which is another way to promote safety. When a condom is not used, there are infraction charges that have to be paid. New Zealand is actually a country that has decriminalized sex work, and we can learn a lot from the benefits of decriminalization from them. So here we'll watch a short video of New Zealand and their decriminalization, then we will discuss.
New Zealand decriminalized prostitution in 2003 and is the world's best example of how society and government can humanely accept and manage what is often recognized as the oldest profession. 5 years after New Zealand implemented the Prostitution Reform Act in 2003, a 2008 government report concluded that despite some community concerns, the PRA has been effective in achieving its purpose. The PRA decriminalized voluntary adult prostitution. The law distinguishes voluntary from involuntary prostitution. Coercing a person to provide sexual services remains a crime. The Prostitution Reform Act prohibits the purchase of sexual services from persons under 18, recognizes sex work as legitimate work, affording sex workers with the same labor protections as other workers. For example, in the wake of COVID-19, sex workers in New Zealand received unemployment benefits. The PRA establishes civil law, recognizing contracts between sex workers and their clients, allows sex workers to refuse to provide services at their discretion, establishes regulations and restrictions on advertising, prohibits brothels or other employers from promoting sex work as a means of getting off government benefits, and obligates employers and sex workers to practice and promote safer sex, allows local governments to establish bylaws regarding zoning and advertising, but does not permit them to prohibit sex work. The 2008 government study found no increase in prostitution since 2003, neither in the number of those providing commercial sex nor in those purchasing it. And since 2003, there have been fewer reports of street-based sex workers as many moved indoors. Sex workers now report violence against them to the police, which has improved relations between police and sex workers. For example, sex workers can call the police if a client refuses to pay them for services. There has been no evidence of an increase in human trafficking. Additionally, the Criminal Records, or Clean Slate Act, allows sex workers to have past convictions removed from their records, which has made it easier for sex workers to leave the industry. New Zealand is the only nation where sex workers are afforded human rights. Since passing the PRA, relationships with police changed for the better. Rather than being targeted and prosecuted, sex workers are now protected by law enforcement. Violent clients can be reported, and community health and safety have improved. New Zealand leads the world in protecting the human rights of sex workers and their communities. The United States needs to do the same. We should all listen to sex workers and stop the arrests. Learn more.
So yes, as was seen in the video, New Zealand passed an act called the New Zealand Prostitution Reform Act in 2003. When this act was being passed, there was a big fear that decriminalization would cause an increase in the people who were involved in the sex industry, like human traffickers or brothels. This was actually not the case, and the amount of people involved in the sex industry remained relatively the same. Sex workers, as was mentioned in the video, developed a trustworthy relationship with the police and were willing to have that communication with them. Crime was also reduced in New Zealand because sex work was no longer illegal. One final thing mentioned in the video is the removal of prior convictions. This is extremely important for offering people a second chance. Removing prior convictions will help with employment opportunities because some employers do prefer workers with no criminal record. Overall, New Zealand shows that decriminalization allows for society to keep functioning and become even stronger by guaranteeing certain rights to sex workers. So here are my discussion questions. First question is, do you think there is any way stigma for sex workers can be reduced? If so, how? Second question is, do you think decriminalization of sex work and workers could happen in the United States? Third question is, prior to this presentation, what did you know about sex workers? What do you think about their occupation now? The fourth question is, not considering New Zealand, do you think decriminalization would encourage people to follow that employment path? And the fifth question is, if criminalization continues, what policy would you create to improve the lives of sex workers? To answer one of my questions, the last one to be exact, If criminalization continues, a policy that I would create to improve the lives of sex workers would be a policy that guarantees these workers their rights. This way, sex workers won't be abused by the power of police officers, and if they have any complaint from their working conditions, they will be able to report that and have their voices be heard. And here is my reference list. Thank you.